Yeah, that was a great and very wide discussion on Ethereum and the EF and things like what the EF is today versus what people want it to be. But next up, we have Phil Girard from Coinbase, Armani Ferrante from Backpack Exchange, Brian Pellegrino from Layer Zero Labs, and 0x Loth from Morpho, and Margot Neinkirk from CoinDesk. And this is scaling the DeFi Mullet, how exchanges are going on-chain.
Thank you. Yeah, let's all go out on stage. Hi, everyone. How are you doing today? All right, well, welcome to our panel, Scaling the DeFi Mullet. We're here to dive into one of the most dynamic shifts in crypto, the evolving blend of centralized finance and front ends with DeFi backends. The reality is that most users probably often enjoy smoother UX and compliance layers that centralized institutions offer, but they also want to take advantage of the real innovations and composability of DeFi backends. So with that, as this model scales, there's also going to be critical challenges like how to ensure interop between ecosystems, how do we enhance security and UX, and what are the roles that institutions, bridges, and other financial primitives play. So here we are today, talk about all of this. You guys are going to answer all these questions. But why don't we get started with the UX part? How can fintechs, apps, and exchanges make the UI simpler for access to DeFi yields or loan programs or whatever, any kind of solutions? Who wants to start with that?
I can start with that.
Go for it.
So the thesis of this talk is the DeFi mullet. So if you're not familiar with it, it's like the mullet, the haircut is it's beautiful when you look at it in the front, but on the side, there's a lot of complex thing going behind. At Coinbase, we just launched a product called crypto-backed loans, and it's exactly that. You have to try it. It's like this great one-click experience that creates a loan on chain, integrated with Morpho, and it uses the power of DeFi, but you don't have to know anything about DeFi. So yeah, I think this is where the game is going and how we can build those experiences.
Yeah. I want to ask also maybe, because I see Brian right next to you, about bridges. Like what kind of role they play? What are the biggest challenges right now in making cross-chain DeFi accessible for CeFi users? And where do bridges come in to solve this?
Yeah, sure. I think when you talk about DeFi Mullet, what you actually want from a user experience, you want them to not think about gas, not think about the underlying chain, and just have some product abstraction, right? Like they want a front end and they click and they do something. And so what do you need to actually do that? You need some of the new upcoming EIPs give you the ability to basically have a wallet that's denominated in largely stable coins. They don't need to have underlying gas, or gas can be sponsored. And so you need something, again, where the user, it should be a single click. Gas should be abstracted and chain should be abstracted. Now, gas abstraction between chains is already done. We've done about $1 billion of gas abstraction just through Layer 0 itself on coding, n-squared pathways across chains. So that's done at scale. Chain abstraction, largely done. You can do multi-hop. You can do a bunch of embedded delegated calls downstream. And so a lot of that stuff is pretty solved. You need front ends to be able to connect to multiple RPCs at the same time, so the user doesn't need to manually think about it. There's a bunch of other things you can do to make life nicer. But I think with what we're talking about in terms of purely CeFi Web 2 custodial, whether it's Robinhood, whether it's PayPal, whether it's Coinbase, whether it's whoever these, all of that is just going to be fully abstracted away. So I actually think we're mostly there on a lot of the Lego pieces. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, I guess I want to ask then a little bit about the Coinbase and Morpho integration. You guys had announced the Bitcoin loan program back in January, and I think that's a prime example of this DeFi mullet concept. So does this integration suggest that centralized exchanges and institutions will increasingly rely on these types of DeFi protocols for lending rather than managing their own books?
Well, I don't know the future, but personally, I think this is really where the game is heading. If you look at Onchain compared to traditional finance, you want to open a loan in traditional finance. It takes multiple weeks. You have to sign paperwork. You have to talk to human. But with Onchain, it's just this instant experience. It takes 10 seconds. You can do it on a Sunday. available 24/7. So I think not only loans, but all the on-chain primitive can be kind of built in this way, and we're gonna leapfrog the banking system. And I think the technology is ready now with Morpho, like for loans, like they have like this incredible like a 600 line of code protocol that's super simple but super robust. And yeah, it's very secure. I'd love to have Lot like talk more about it if you want.
Yeah, sure. So as you described, the beauty of this product is like from the Coinbase experience, a user has a Bitcoin balance and eventually has USDC at the end of the flow. What happens is like the BTC is going to be turned natively into CBBTC and then take a deposition on the Morpho protocol. The money is taken from the blockchain, from the CBBTC USDC market, which is canonical. That means that anyone, Coinbase does, but anyone could tap into this market in the future. And I think the biggest edge or the most interesting thing for fintechs is network effects. So the biggest the Morpho network effect is, the deeper the liquidity on Morpho becomes, and then the price impact on fintechs become like super interesting. And fintechs, sexes, I think are getting closer to banks. They're all competing towards the same clients. Revolut was nothing 10 years ago. I think now they have like 60 million users. And you think about like the key product of lending is like interest and depth of liquidity. And so I feel like the more sort of like fintechs get into these permissionless markets, they have access to highly competitive banking products that usually were like permissioned, closed source, and kind of like extractive. So I'm not exactly sure, for instance, if you think about earn or borrow, but like it's very difficult for Revolut or any fintech, or even Coinbase, to issue a loan at a cost which is close to like the treasury bill, right? So you have this, I think like tapping into the network effect of permissionless liquidity is like super big. And the other thing which I think interests fintech is integration costs. So if you're a fintech and if you're building on top of like someone else, you have a big technical debt. If you use something like Morpho in the case of Coinbase, you're using 600 lines of immutable code. Immutable code means like you have to do this integration once and it's done forever. So this ownership of the stack via like immutability is, I think, another big part of like great interest rate, great products, but also like a one-off technical cost that never changes in the future.
I also think it's super important that we just like address that, like the Mullet is great, and we've talked a lot in the past about like creating better consumer experiences, and I think the last 18 months has been like onboarding retail and creating better. But if the rails in the background aren't like really, really solid, like we tried an iteration of this prior where there were like 50 Y Combinator companies that were all building front ends for Luna Terra, right? Like you actually need the underlying things to be strong, robust, and like have primitives that work and are secure, because at the end of the day, like just abstracting away for the end user if the protocol beneath isn't actually really sound is probably more problematic than helpful.
I would love to piggyback on that, Brian. So I think what all three of you kind of touched on, but not explicitly articulate, is what I would argue the most important primitive to unlock the DeFi mullet, which I think a lot of people in Ethereum already understand, especially relative to other ecosystems, which is account abstraction. So you might ask the question, why do people use centralized exchanges? It's because it's the best user experience. That's it. Mm-hmm. Centralized exchanges figured it all out. So build a product that looks and feels like a centralized exchange. However, we all know that self-custody is the most important property of crypto. If we don't have self-custody, then kind of like, what's the point? What are we all doing here? Let's all go back home and go work in AI or TradFi or whatever. And so the question is ultimately, how do you achieve the centralized exchange user experience where it's genuinely your home, you have this great product, email, password, 2FA, you're in, but how do you do that without losing self-custody? And to motivate this, maybe for people that aren't so, for which this isn't so obvious, I opened up the Solflare app the other day. It's one of the popular wallets on Solana, and I was going through the account setup process, standard wallet thing, right? Set up your mnemonic, copy it, so on and so forth. And they give you this really jaw-dropping statistic. It's really spectacular what they tell you. What they tell you is $4.2 billion. $4.2 billion is lost every year from people that lose access to their seed phrase. Mm-hmm. If that is not the most spectacular, utter failure of a product, I don't know what it is. And this is like wallets today. So it's my view that wallets are completely and totally and utterly broken. There are zero exceptions to this. It's more than every centralized exchange hack or collapse every single year. We're basically giving knives to a bunch of babies and everybody's stabbing themselves. It's it's like ridiculous. And so I think this is like the topic that I think needs to be solved. And I think luckily the pathway is relatively straightforward and clear from a technical point of view. I think from the perspective of like how do you actually get distribution on account abstraction, I think the biggest challenge is just path dependency. So the way most apps are not built with account abstraction in mind. And so whether it's resource constraints, design patterns and smart contracts, or one of like a million other edge cases that people have not accounted for because all of these runtimes and all these smart contracts and all these apps have been built with EOA public keys as the concept of an identity, I think that is like the big challenge. And so, I mean, it's really cool to see ecosystems, for example, like Near, like build from scratch with account abstraction in mind. But I think that is one of the big mountains that Ethereum and Solana and the industry at large needs to climb. And like, it's very hard to come to consensus on like what those patterns and standards are. But I think that is the primitive for me that I think needs to get complete and total dominance to unlock the DeFi mullet in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, I want to linger on that a little bit because at Coinbase, we've been trying like for several years to do this thing. And we've tried a bunch of things, nothing stick. And I think what really made it for you, like this self-custody aspect, I think was the really tricky part. And for us, I want to share a secret with you guys if you want to experiment in other company. We combined passkey with smart account and layer 2s. And that's really what made it, like those three technology coming together is really what created that experience. And I think that thing wasn't available or production ready like a year ago. And that I really, really hope that I think 2025, 2026, we'll see like more and more of these things come out because the technology is ready now. And yeah, it's incredible experience. If you haven't tried it, like you should. Like it's completely different than setting up like your seed phrases. So yeah.
This was a great like roundabout, but we hear a lot about wallet abstraction and smart contract capabilities for recovery and things like that, and bringing those easier experience to the user. I also wanted to ask a little bit on the security side of things. Like, how are you guys thinking about teaching your users about the risks or the advantages of accessing, loans on chain or trading on chain versus like trading versus a centralized model? How do you teach the users like the risks and rewards of each?
Well, there's multiple aspects to it. I think there's a morpho aspect to it. Like talking about like the Coinbase integration with morpho on Coinbase side. There's many things we can do. Add guardrails around, for example, the morpho protocol. The morpho protocol allows you to take a 86% LTV loan. But when you use the Coinbase app, we add some additional guardrails around that. You can only go to 75. We add like loan liquidation notification for you. So really like this user first experience. But then on morpho side, I guess there's some additional security feature in there.
Yeah, but I think just the thesis of the Mullet is exactly this, like you de-risk the back end by using blockchains and immutable code, and then you provide the front end with, as you were describing, like super like 2FA recovery, like all the features that like no one needs to know they have a wallet, then they need to use a wallet. And that's it. And I think the Mullet is essentially de-risking exchanges with like infrastructure, which is on-chain, immutable, can't change. Like we talked about before, like this integration uses 600 lines of code. It's a single market. You put CBBTC, you borrow USDC, that's it. There's nothing else. There's no like mingling of funds. Coinbase doesn't manage any debt position. It's like a user has a private key, he doesn't know, takes a debt position, has USDC on his balance, and then can do anything he wants with this USDC. So I feel like how do we mitigate with security? We bring this kind of like hybrid imperative and makes it a standard in every exchange. So I wonder actually how is Backpack, for instance, building with the Coinbase like an abstraction suite? Do you have your own things? Are you using like paymasters, or like how does the industry like go towards the same standard of abstraction on the kind of like exchange level?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we said earlier in the back here that we would have trouble finding disagreement, but let me throw some spice into this. So I think there's two aspects of risk when you're talking about DeFi, and DeFi predominantly helps you with one of those aspects, the custody aspect. Your keys, your coins, so on and so forth. However, when you're using any margin platform, I don't know if this is obvious to people, but you don't actually have self-custody. You don't own your assets when you lend. You don't own your assets when you trade perps. It doesn't matter if it's on Binance. It doesn't matter if it's on Aave. It doesn't matter where it is. The margin system owns your assets. And in order for the system to work, the liquidator has to be able to unilaterally take you out. You can't just like pull your funds out no matter what. You are subject to the rules of the system, whether it's utilization or whether it's some operator off chain or whatever. And what DeFi gives you is the ability to decentralize that risk, the ability to verify that the state transition is correct. But ultimately, the question is, who is modeling those risk parameters, and is that correct? And I think this is maybe one of the more important aspects of the security conversation that people don't necessarily touch or maybe acknowledge. And bankruptcy is a valid state transition, whether you're in DeFi or whether you're not. And so when we're talking about this conversation of whether it's how you build it or how do you educate users, those are like the two topics that you need to touch on. And the second topic exists regardless of where you are. To answer your question, I mean, I think with Backpack, we do have an account abstraction product, maybe without going into technical details, although I will kind of say that it is possible to do it without losing self-custody in like a genuine sense, like no marketing, no gimmicks, like the code's there, it's verifiable. If the exchange tries to rug you, you can unilaterally withdraw your funds with nothing but a terminal and an internet connection to a validator. And that to me is self-custody. And so I think it's tempting when we're talking about the DeFi mullet to take shortcuts. But I think you have to have or consider all of these things when you're talking about risk and security and so on and so forth.
Brian, I want to bring you into this and explain sort of the role of interop solutions. How does that fit into everything we're talking about right now? And how does that become a standard piece of infrastructure in the DeFi mullet experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a large part, we already are, right? So Layer 0 is about $100 billion of assets built on top of it right now, like $240 billion of asset issuers, $100 billion of actual assets. And you start to see more and more of people that live at the intersection of this DeFi mullet. So PayPal announced their PYUSD. This is going to be integrated within the PayPal platform, right? 2 days ago, I was announced that we were the #1 provider, so we'll be doing the Wyoming State Bank, the Wyoming stablecoin. So all of these things are starting to bridge these parts of, whether it be fintechs, whether it be traditional finance, whether it be whatever, into these underlying ecosystems. Our entire role has always been, we're happy to be quietly in the background, and no user should ever think about us. We're a thing for developers, we're a tool, we're immutable, all of these things. And what you want is those assets to be able to be used when you talk about like a user experience. A user doesn't care that the app they want to use, they want to lend to a pool that's on Arbitrum or on Optimism or on Base or on whatever chain, they don't care. It's on Solana, none of that matters to the end user. There's a thing that they want to do, some product feature or experience or application that they want to interact with. They should be able to click. It shouldn't matter where their assets are from, so you can move. One of the nice parts about us with this new Tether, the USDT 0 integration, we moved $80 million into ink for $1.50, right? You can basically move like unlimited size. There is no longer this restriction of external bridges. You're not paying 10 bips or 15 bips to do these transactions. It is literally, you can move $1 billion for like a fraction of a cent if you're going between Solana and an L2. And so that ability just allows those rails to be as seamless as humanly possible. Again, the user shouldn't care where their asset lives right now. They shouldn't care about the chain. They shouldn't care about the gas. All of that stuff is getting abstracted in the back end. And I do think there is this component of education to the developer, to the end user, on what they're actually interacting with. Again, you can make a really beautiful interface that has Terra Luna as a back end, and that's like not a good thing, right? So you have to be able to build rails that are robust and have been battle tested, and expose the users to them and give people kind of ideally free choice and free markets and self-custody and all of those things that come along with it. And for the users who want a more bankified experience, or the fintechs who want to expose that backend, I think that's great as well.
Loth, I quickly want to get back to you on Morpho, and I want to get your take on how you see Morpho's lending model being integrated into more CeFi-like experiences.
So the kind of like beauty of Morpho is like you can have markets for any assets. That means any sort of compliance, but with the caveat that the product of DeFi is, as I said, network effect and depth. So the bigger the CBBTC market becomes, the more people can borrow and lend to it with the best terms and the best rates, which I think is like very important. So the Morpho protocol, and I think this market's gonna grow and be integrated in the backend of like other fintechs. So SEXs like Coinbase is the first step, but you think about like other players like Robinhood, like Revolut, who have their native stablecoins. They might want to create like another product from that. They can create a Morpho market that again expose their users to a single collateral by virtue of Morpho being like isolating lending pools. So the compliance aspect, or the fact that you can expose your user to a very specific part of like the stack with a code that cannot change, an oracle that cannot change, an LTV that cannot change, is very strong. And I think like Morpho doesn't like pretend to be more than it is, which is a market on chain that was deployed once. Mm-hmm. And you can just build like any type of abstraction on top with the guarantee of the infrastructure being here and running like forever. And as I think we kind of alluded to, like payments is the backbone of DeFi. So as you said, you can like transfer money for a fraction of the cost. What if you can take out money permissionlessly at, again, a fraction of the cost, where like a lot of people today like cannot borrow with their assets. And the BTC product is a good example of like take a BTC loan without creating like a taxable event is a very big moment for like retail. So I feel like the role of Morpho will be like across the stack, from like we're starting with centralized exchanges, but tomorrow you see Fidelity, Apollo coming on chain. They have reward assets that so could have like some sort of like new use cases. So like a credit fund on chain where anyone can take a debt out of this, and as a lender you could be exposed to this and get something like 10%. That's pretty big. So I feel like it's a very hybrid moment right now. The Mullet is one aspect of this, but Morpho can be used for like any type of assets. And so I'm very kind of like excited to see these newer assets, new like exotic or non-exotic typology of collateral on chain that will enable lots of new use cases.
You bring up like mainstream adoption and tapping into Morpho or DeFi Mullet or whatever kind of experiences they can get by going on chain. And I have a sign here that says wrap up. So I do want to wrap up on that note and ask you guys, is this DeFi Mullet just a transitional model, or is this going to be the dominant structure for the next 5 to 10 years, especially as mainstream institutions start to pay more attention to crypto and DeFi and everything that it has to offer? Why don't we, I don't know, do we want to start with Armani and then make our way back?
So I think it depends on what you're looking for. I think what DeFi ultimately gives you, what everything on-chain ultimately gives you, is the ability for different people that otherwise wouldn't work together to ultimately like work together, right? Everybody in the U.S. is happy with U.S. capital markets. They're the deepest, they're the most liquid capital markets that exist in the world. And so it's like, why use DeFi, right? And the real answer, I think, is because you get global capital formation. You get people from China, people from Europe, people from Africa, people South America. You're opening up capital to the entire world to coordinate in a way that they otherwise wouldn't work before. But I have 25 seconds left, so I'll just stop.
So I believe it's going to be hybrid for the reason you just mentioned. I think like DeFi should focus on code and liquidity depth, and whatever the abstraction on top should focus on like abstractions and like bringing distribution.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, yes, global permissionless markets should be able to provide ideally better and more exotic rates that eventually front end will want to expose their users to.
Yeah, same for me. My answer is yes. Like, for example, emails, right? Nobody knows what IMAP is. Like, you don't know what the underlying protocol is. You use email, and I think we created the same kind of primitive. You're opening a loan. You're not like going on chain, going to a lending protocol. So yes is my answer. It's the end game.
Great. Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. And thank you,
Thanks.
panelists.